The collapse of the perfect plan on the trail of the men who escaped Alcatraz. Part 1. The night the rock exhaled. There are prisons built to hold a body, and then there are prisons built to crush the idea of escape itself. Alcatraz was the second kind. It stood in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay like a warning carved out of stone, a place designed not merely to lock men away, but to convince them that hope was irrational. Long before it became the most feared federal prison in America, the island had already lived several lives: a military post, a fortress, a prison ground shaped by war and discipline. Then, in 1934, the federal government transformed it into a maximum security, minimum privilege penitentiary for inmates considered especially violent, disruptive, or likely to escape. The message was clear: if other prisons had failed to break a man's will, Alcatraz would finish the job. Everything about the island worked like psychological architecture. The water was close enough to see and impossible to trust. The city glowed in the distance like a taunt. Birds watched from towers. Steel, concrete, routine, and silence did the rest. Alcatraz earned its myth not just because it held notorious prisoners, but because it made the outside world feel close enough to Iqra and far enough to be unreachable. During its years as a federal prison, from 1934 to 1963, 36 men tried to escape in 14 separate attempts. Nearly all were caught or died trying. That record gave the island its reputation, not just difficult to flee, but almost designed to erase the very concept of getting away. And yet, in every fortress ever built, there comes a moment when a flaw stops being a flaw and becomes an invitation. The three men who would test Alcatraz most famously were not dreamers in the romantic sense. They were convicts, survivors, and repeat escape risks. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960 with a long criminal history that included bank robbery, burglary, and repeated escape attempts from other prisons. Later that same year came John Anglin. Early in 1961, his brother Clarence followed. All three already knew one another from earlier time behind bars, and once assigned to adjoining cells, they began planning together. Another inmate, Alan West, joined the effort. According to the FBI reconstruction, Morris was widely regarded as the intellectual center of the plan. That is often how legends begin, not with one impossible act, but with four men in neighboring cells sharing a dangerous kind of patience. Imagine the evenings in B Block, the small routines, the footsteps in corridors, the sound of guards moving through a place where every minute had weight. Somewhere inside the monotony, a thought hardened into a method. If they could not defeat the prison head-on, they would have to dissolve into its blind spots. They would not run through gates or overpower towers or swim naked into the black water on a desperate whim. They would prepare. They would become craftsmen of impossibility. And the most unsettling part is this: it worked because they were willing to turn scraps into engineering. According to the FBI, the planning began in late 1961, when the group found old saw blades and realized the air vents at the back of their cells might be widened. Using crude tools, including a homemade drill powered by the motor of a broken vacuum cleaner, they carefully drilled around the vent covers until they could remove sections of wall. Once openings appeared, they hid them with cardboard, luggage, and other ordinary objects. Behind those vents lay an unguarded utility corridor. Beyond that corridor lay the possibility of the roof. And above the roof, at last, was the open night. It was not a jailbreak built on force. It was built on repetition. A little noise, a little dust, a little concrete chipped away. A little lie maintained every day until the lie became a tunnel. That is what makes the escape so eerie even now. They did not conquer Alcatraz in a single burst of brilliance. They slowly taught the prison to ignore the sounds of its own undoing. Beyond the cells, they established a hidden workshop above the cell block in a space the prison did not adequately watch. There they built what they would need for the final crossing. More than 50 stolen or gathered raincoats were transformed into improvised life preservers and a rubber raft measuring roughly 6 by 14 feet. The seams were stitched and then sealed with heat from the prison's hot pipes. They made wooden paddles. They improvised a way to inflate the raft using a converted musical instrument. They even fashioned a fake bolt out of soap to disguise how they had tampered with the roof ventilator. This was not reckless desperation. It was patient, almost obsessive preparation. But even preparation alone was not enough. To buy time, they needed the prison to believe they were still in their cells while they were already moving through the dark. So they made faces. Not masks for themselves, faces for the beds they would leave behind. Dummy heads. Human imitations. Sleeping decoys built from plaster, paint, and real hair collected from the prison barber shop floor. There is something deeply uncanny about that detail. A prison is supposed to control bodies. These men created false bodies and used them to trick the system into watching emptiness. When guards glanced in during the night, they saw what they expected to see. 3 men sleeping under blankets, heads resting on pillows, another evening passing without incident. But expectation is one of the oldest weaknesses in any security system. By the time the final night came, the plan had become almost too elaborate to seem real. And yet reality is exactly what made it terrifying. On the evening of June 11, 1962, after lights out, the 4 conspirators began their attempt. This is where the legend becomes almost cinematic, except for one cruel fracture. Alan West could not free his own vent in time. The opening in his cell had narrowed after repairs, and hardened material made escape too slow. The others went on without him. Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through the backs of their cells into the corridor, climbed through the interior routes they had prepared, reached the roof through the ventilator, and then descended toward the edge of the island. From there, they crossed fences, moved to the northeast shore, and prepared to launch their handmade raft into the bay. That image has survived for decades because it feels like the edge of myth. 3 men carrying a raft sewn from prison raincoats. A dark island behind them, black water ahead, the glow of San Francisco not far away, and impossibly far all at once. Were they terrified? Almost certainly. Were they confident? Perhaps. Did they know the tides well enough? No one can say for sure. What we do know is that once they pushed away from the island, they entered a story no one has ever been able to finish with certainty. Morning came on June 12, and with it came the shock. The early bed check found Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin missing. In their cells were the dummy heads, still lying where the guards had accepted them as sleeping men. The prison locked down immediately. The search began at once. Alcatraz, built to raise hope, had been humiliated in the one way it could not forgive. 3 prisoners had vanished from inside the nation's most secure federal prison, and no one could say exactly where they had gone. First hours after their disappearance must have felt unreal on the island. Guards, officers, investigators, everyone would have understood that this was no routine breach. The men had not simply slipped a door or climbed a fence. They had studied the prison like a machine and found the rhythm in its breathing. They had hidden labor inside routine. They had turned raincoats into a boat, soap into hardware, plaster into sleeping faces, and a sealed cell into a stage set. In stories about prison escapes, people often remember the leap, the run, the water, the final risk. But Alcatraz was broken long before the raft ever touched the bay. It was broken the moment the prison stopped noticing what was happening inside its own walls. That is why the story still grips people. Because what collapsed that night was not just a security system. It was a myth. The myth that Alcatraz could see everything. The myth that no one could outthink the rock. The myth that stone, steel, and cold water were enough to contain the human need to try one more time. And yet the true mystery did not begin with the escape itself. It began after. Because a prison break can be described. A route can be reconstructed. A plan can be studied. But the bay keeps secrets. Searches began almost immediately. The FBI coordinated with the Coast Guard, prison officials, and other agencies, while both operators in the bay were asked to watch for debris or signs of the fugitives. Within 2 days, a packet of letters connected to the men was recovered, sealed in rubber. Investigators also found paddle-like pieces of wood, rubber inner tube fragments, and a homemade life vest that washed ashore on Conkite Beach. A similar paddle was recovered on Angel Island. These clues proved movement, preparation, and contact with the water, but not survival. They suggested a path, not an ending. And this is where the story stops being a clean heist tale and becomes something stranger. Because there are only 2 endings people want from a mystery like this. Either the sea took them, or the world missed them. One ending is tragic. The other is almost unbearable in its audacity. Could 3 men really break out of Alcatraz, cross the bay, reach land, disappear into America, and stay ghosts forever? The official investigators of the time leaned hard in the opposite direction. The FBI later summarized its reasoning clearly. The waters were cold and dangerous. The currents were strong. No supporting thefts of clothes or a getaway car were discovered onshore despite the case's huge publicity. The families appeared to lack the means to sustain them, and no credible evidence surfaced over 17 years to prove the men were alive in the United States or abroad. On December 31, 1979, the FBI formally closed its case and transferred responsibility to the U.S. Marshals Service. But closing a file is not the same thing as burying a legend, because no bodies were found. And when bodies are missing, stories multiply. That is where part 1 ends. Not with 3 men safely ashore. Not with 3 men certainly drowned. But with a raft leaving the northeastern edge of Alcatraz, and a question disappearing into the dark with it. Were they swallowed by the bay? Or did the perfect prison fail for real? The collapse of the perfect plan. On the trail of the men who escaped Alcatraz. Part 2 Beneath the Water. Beyond the fog. Mysteries survive for one of 2 reasons. Because the truth is too well hidden. Or because the truth itself was never simple. The escape from Alcatraz endures because it offers birth. The plan was real. The route was real. The dummy heads, the workshop, the raincoat raft, the missing men, none of that belongs to folklore. Those parts are documented. What remains uncertain is the final crossing, and everything that might have happened after the darkness of San Francisco Bay closed around them. The historical record gives us evidence, fragments, theories, official conclusions, and later challenges to those conclusions. It does not give us a final scene. And for a story like this, that absence is everything. If the men drowned, then the escape is still extraordinary but tragic, unfinished, swallowed by the very bear Alcatraz relied on for its power. If they survived, then the meaning changes completely. Then the rock was not merely breached, it was defeated. Then the most famous prison in America was not the end of the line at all, but the opening chapter of one of the greatest disappearances in criminal history. For decades, the official position leaned toward death in the water. That judgment was not invented out of laziness. It came from the bay itself. The FBI emphasized the cold water, the powerful currents, and the lack of reliable post-escape evidence. The Bureau also noted that the escapee's supposed next step, stealing clothing and a car after reaching land, never produced the kind of trace investigators expected in such a high-profile case. After 17 years of investigation, officials said they had found no credible sign that Morris or the Anglin brothers were alive in the United States or overseas. From an investigator's point of view, the simplest explanation was that the bay had done the work Alcatraz had hoped it always would. But simplicity has always struggled against this particular mystery, because there are details that refuse to sit quietly. The recovered paddle on Angel Island, the life vest on shore, a packet of letters sealed in rubber, the simple fact that nobody ever drifted back into certainty. None of those facts prove survival, but they also prevented the case from becoming clean. They left just enough room for the imagination to keep breathing. And once imagination enters a historical mystery, it becomes almost impossible to drive out. Over time, the escape stopped being just a law enforcement case and became a cultural obsession. It moved into documentaries, books, film arguments, family lore, television specials, and whispered what-if conversations that stretched across decades. Yet beneath the mythology, the central question remained brutally practical. Was survival physically possible? For a long time, many people assumed the answer was no. Then science complicated the story. In 2014, researchers using hydrodynamic modeling of San Francisco Bay revisited the conditions on the night of the escape. Their work suggested that the outcome may have depended heavily on launch time. According to that modeling, if the men had left around the long assumed time of roughly 10 p.m., the outgoing tide likely would have pushed them west toward the Golden Gate rather than north toward Angel Island. But if they launched later around 11:30 p.m., they may have had a real chance of reaching shore near the Golden Gate Bridge area, with debris then drifting in the direction of Angel Island. In other words, the bay may not have made survival impossible. It may have made survival exquisitely dependent on timing. That changed the emotional shape of the mystery. Not because it proved the men lived. It did not. But because it reopened the door that official history had nearly shut. It transformed survival from a fantasy into a physical possibility. A narrow one, yes. A difficult one, absolutely. But no longer absurd. And once survival became plausible again, every rumor gained oxygen. Every claim sighting mattered a little more. Every family anecdote sounded less impossible. Every old photograph, every half-credible tip, every rumor of secret contact suddenly felt like something that had to be looked at one more time. This is where the Alcatraz story becomes more than an escape narrative. It becomes a tug-of-war between institutions and uncertainty. Official agencies prefer conclusions that can be defended. The public prefers endings that can still surprise. The Bay, meanwhile, offers neither. It holds on to silence and lets everyone else project meaning onto the fog. One of the most famous later developments came from a handwritten letter that surfaced publicly in 2018 but had reportedly been sent to San Francisco police in 2013. The writer claimed to be John Anglin and said that his brother Clarence and Frank Morris had all survived the escape, though only barely. The letter also claimed that Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence in 2011. According to reporting at the time, the letter was examined for handwriting, fingerprints, and DNA, but those tests were inconclusive, and authorities did not treat it as definitive proof. In other words, the letter ignited the mystery without solving it. That may be the cruel brilliance of this case. Every new clue seems to do the same thing. It doesn't close the door. It only moves the shadows around inside the room. If the letter was real, then the greatest prison escape in American history may have succeeded, and one of the participants lived long enough to try negotiating his final years. If it was false, then it still tells us something important. Even more than half a century later, the Alcatraz escape is such a powerful wound in the public imagination that someone can step into the legend and be believed, at least for a moment. And then there is the strangest modern detail of all. The case never fully died. The FBI formally ended its investigation in 1979 and handed responsibility to the U.S. Marshals Service. Yet the men remain profiled fugitives in the Northern District of California on the Marshals' official site even now. That does not prove they are alive. It means something subtler and, in its own way, more fascinating. The U.S. government never reached a point of complete certainty. Officially, the possibility, however remote, was never erased. That fact alone gives the story an almost supernatural endurance. Think about it. A prison that closed in 1963. An escape that happened in 1962. A case the FBI gave up in 1979. And still, decades later, the names remain standing in official fugitive listings like ghosts who never signed out of history. This is why the Alcatraz escape is different from most unsolved cases. In many mysteries, uncertainty fades with time. Records decay. Witnesses die. Public attention drifts elsewhere. But here, time seems to have deepened the legend rather than weakened it. The longer no answer appears, the more powerful both endings become. Picture the first ending. The raft pushes out into the black water. The current catches them wrong. The coal begins to strip away strength. Their hands, already raw from preparation and stone and steel and rope, lose power on the paddles. The city lights remain visible but meaningless. The bay decides the matter within an hour. No dramatic cries. No witnesses. Just water and dark, and three men erased so completely that even their bodies never return to argue with the official conclusion. That ending is possible. It is grim, believable, and in some ways consistent with what investigators thought. Now picture the second ending. The timing is right. The raft survives. They drift west, then angle toward land at just the moment the tide slackens. They make shore somewhere north of the bridge, soaked, half frozen, but alive. They bury or abandon what they must. They find clothing. They move separately or with help. They vanish not by magic, but by discipline. They understand that the first days are everything, then the first weeks, then the first months, and after that, maybe, the hunt begins to fail because the world is larger and the men it is chasing are finally outside the cage that taught them how to think like fugitives. That ending is also possible, at least physically, according to later modelling. The brilliance of the title shows were they buried beneath the water, or are they still among us? Is that it captures exactly why this mystery refuses to rest. The question is not merely whether they died or lived. It is whether institutions truly understood the men they were hunting. Frank Morris was not an impulsive fool. John and Clarence Anglin were not men trying a spontaneous swim. These were inmates who had outplanned a fortress. They had patience. They had nerve. They had shown that they could work for months without drawing fatal attention. Anyone capable of that kind of deception inside Alcatraz would also be capable of understanding the value of disappearing forever outside it. That does not prove they did, but it is one reason people still hesitate to accept drowning as the only serious answer. And yet we should be honest about the opposite possibility too. Legends have gravity. They pull us towards survival because survival is a more thrilling ending. We want the system beaten. We want the perfect prison exposed. We want three silent figures to have stepped out of the bay and into a new life so cleanly that America itself lost them. But history does not owe us satisfying endings. Sometimes the daring part is real and the triumph is not. Sometimes the last act belongs to nature, not ingenuity. That tension, the war between what we want to believe and what the evidence can actually carry, is exactly why this case has never closed in the human imagination. If they died, then Alcatraz still failed in one sense. It allowed the attempt, and the attempt became immortal. If they lived, then Alcatraz failed in every sense that mattered. Either way, the prison lost something that night it never got back. Its invincibility. And maybe that is the true collapse hidden inside this story. Not merely the collapse of a plan, but the collapse of certainty itself. The guards lost certainty when they found plaster faces on pillows. The investigators lost certainty when clues appeared without a body. The public lost certainty when later science suggested survival might have been possible. And history lost certainty when official agencies left the final answer unresolved. So what are we left with? A prison island in a freezing bay. 3 missing men. 1 accomplice left behind. A raft made from raincoats. Paddles, fence, soap bolts, dummy heads, and a dawn bed check that turned into one of the greatest embarrassments in American prison history. Federal investigation that ran 17 years without a conclusive answer. A case still haunting official records. And above all, we are left with a final image no document can settle. 3 shadows moving away from Alcatraz. Not toward freedom exactly. Not yet. Only away from certainty. The water below them is black. The city ahead is distant. The prison behind them is still lit. And somewhere between those two worlds, the perfect plan either died or disappeared so well that even now, decades later, the world is still asking where it ended. That is why the Alcatraz escape survives. Not because we know, but because we do not. Because some mysteries are not kept alive by evidence alone. They are kept alive by the intolerable possibility that the impossible may have happened once and gotten away with it.